This is the lecture for Week 7, Topic 1. This is Part 2. In Part 1, we discussed terrestrial sedimentary environments, and now we are moving into marine depositional environments. The different types of marine deposits can be separated out into abyssal, which is very deep water, submarine fans, shallow marine environments, and reefs, which are also sort of semi-transitional environments between ocean and land. The chart here shows different characteristics of some of these various sedimentary environments. Let's start with some basics on the shape of the ocean. We start at dry land. The next thing you see after dry land is something we call the continental shelf, which is the part of the edge of a continent between the shoreline and what we call the continental slope, or the edge of the continent. It is usually covered by shallow ocean waters and has a very gentle slope. It's usually nearly flat, very low relief. Seaward of the continental shelf is the continental slope, where the edge of the continental shelf transitions toward deep ocean waters. At the base of the continental slope, we get the continental rise, which is an area of shallower slopes downslope of the main continental slope that is mainly made of underwater landslide deposits. Below that, we have the abyssal plain, which is the deepest part of the ocean. It is usually pretty flat and consists of sediments directly on top of basaltic oceanic crust. It's important to know that while in these diagrams the continental slope looks like a pretty steep hillside that drops off fairly rapidly, these are actually quite gentle slopes, and they are dropping 10,000 feet over 50, 70 miles rather than being a steep slope directly down into the deep ocean. But we're going to start by reminding ourselves that clastic sediments are created by weathering of rock on land. They are then transported to the shore by wind, water, or ice. Then waves and currents can move the finer-grained clastic sediments offshore. Wind can actually deposit clay and silt anywhere over the ocean, where it then sinks to form mud or shale. The other type of sediment is chemical sediment, which are just atoms dissolved in water, which comes from water dissolving minerals on land from rock outcrops, and then those dissolved minerals are carried in the moving water into the ocean. Dissolved chemical sediments or atoms are then used by marine organisms to make shells, or they can precipitate directly out of the seawater. In the deep ocean or abyssal plain, we call the sediments ooze, and that is our new featured word for this lecture. Ooze is the sediment of the deep sea, of which at least 30% is the skeletal remains of plankton. It is very soft mud and clay. This includes clay particles carried by wind and currents, animal remains that have settled out of the water column, and other debris that we call marine snow that settles out of the water column. Ooze varies in composition based on the depth of the water and its location on the planet. This figure on the right shows the distribution of different types of ooze across the world. In purple, we have the calcareous ooze, which is an ooze made up dominantly of calcium carbonate and carbonate planktons. Remember, that's calcite, which later becomes limestone. Calcite can only exist at certain depths within the ocean, because when you get too deep, the pressure is too great and the calcite remains dissolved in the ocean water. And that leaves us with areas that have no calcium on the ocean floor, and we have different types of sediments being deposited. The red clays are very widespread in the northern Pacific, as well as siliceous ooze, which is made of the skeletons of silica-based plankton. There are some plankton that have skeletons made of silica or glass, and these plankton will settle out and create siliceous ooze in the deepest part of the ocean. There are other types of sediments. Terrigenous sediment, which has the root terra in it, indicating land, and that is sediment derived from the continents or land. And we have hydrogenous sediment, which has the root hydro in it, which is precipitated directly out of seawater. Our calcareous oozes, again, are calcium-based oozes, mostly dead plankton, and our siliceous oozes generally are found in areas that are too deep for calcium to remain because of a thing called the calcite compensation depth, which you can look up if you're interested in that, which forces the calcium to remain dissolved in the seawater, which leaves behind the silica plankton skeletons as the dominant sediment. This is what ooze looks like in cores. You can send tubes down to the seafloor and take up cores of the ocean sediment. Here on this figure on the top, we can see the color changes in this ooze, which correspond with climatic changes in the world. We have this gray ooze from the early Eocene period, about 45 million years ago, and then that grades to darker and darker brown, and then we reach this line, which represents a major climate shift. And then we have the Oligocene period, which is, off the top of my head, 38 million years ago. And that corresponds with a massive climate change around the world that is recorded as this color change in these ocean sediments. This microscope picture of some ooze shows the tiny, tiny particles of clay and silt, as well as these larger, round particles of different plankton skeletons. We started on the abyssal plain. Now we're going to get a little less deep, a little higher, and talk about the continental rise. That is the gentle slope between the continental slope and the abyssal plain. It's a very shallow, gentle slope where the elevation can change about 1 foot vertically over 1 to 500 feet horizontally. So very gentle slope. Sediments in the continental rise are composed mainly of alluvial and underwater landslide deposits. Remember, an alluvial deposit is any deposit left by moving water, and an underwater landslide is pretty self-explanatory. But they are nevertheless interesting, so we're going to talk about turbidity currents, which are the result of underwater landslides. Landslides will come off the continental shelf either from overloading of sediment and oversteepening of that edge, or they are shaken loose by earthquakes. These landslides then send out a huge plume of sediment out into the deeper ocean. This video shows a model in a tank made by Western Washington University that shows what underwater turbidity currents look like. So we can see our landslide released and our sediment plume billows out in this huge underwater cloud that moves very quickly underwater. The real large turbidity currents under the ocean can move 70, 80 miles an hour. Some of the sediment moves right along the floor of the ocean. It is slid and pushed along, and these are our coarser sediments, and the finer sediments are floating up in the water column and settle out over time. This produces graded bedding, which we talked about in a previous lecture. Series of turbidity currents create stacks of graded bedding separated by layers of shale. For instance, you will have a layer of shale, then a graded bed, then a layer of shale, then a graded bed, and that goes on, and we call this a turbidite sequence, a turbidite being this underwater landslide deposit. We can see one on the right. We have this dark gray shale, which is very fine silt and clay sediment size. Then above that, we have a graded sandstone bed with these larger pieces, these larger clasts on the bottom, which get finer or smaller as you go up in the section. And then you reach this massive bedded sandstone, which consists of sediments that settled out immediately following the landslide. Sequences of underwater landslides called turbidite sequences usually look like this in outcrop. This is very distinctive for continental rise environments. Higher up on the continental shelf, we are getting into an area that is more dominated by terrigenous continental sediments. The sand is dropped at the shore and near the shore, but silt and clay are transported further out and are deposited on the continental shelf. Eventually, you get far enough away from the continent that the water is too still to transport terrigenous sediments at all. The sand deposited near the shore transitions to mud, which transitions to limestone with increasing distance from the shore. These continental shelf deposits are also sensitive to and subject to changes in sea level. Low global sea levels will expose the continental shelf, and high global sea levels flood the continental shelf, which is our current global condition. So for example, on the left, this diagram shows that average continental source rocks, which is often granitic, undergo complete weathering and separation during transport and recycling. These products of weathering result in mixed grain weathering products, including quartz sand, which is usually deposited on the beach and near shore, clay mud, which is deposited on the near shelf, the part of the continental shelf near the shore, and then ions in solution. chemical ions dissolved in the water, which then precipitates out often as calcite farther out on the continental shelf, and we call these carbonates. The sequence of sediments deposited by rising sea levels is called a transgression sequence. This usually results in limestone above mudstone above sandstone as the water gets deeper. Looking at New England on the east coast of the US, we have a very large continental shelf that extends out approximately 200 miles from shore. Currently, limestone is being deposited out on the far edge of this continental shelf. But when sea levels were lower, for example during the last ice age, the edge of the continental shelf was actually the coastline, so we had sand getting deposited instead. As sea level rose, the sand was buried by mud as the water got deeper, and then that mud was buried by limestone as the water got even deeper as sea level rose. And we call this sequence a transgression. The opposite sequence, where sea levels are lowering, is called a regression. And that gives you a sequence of sand on top of mud on top of limestone, rather than limestone on top of mud on top of sand, so it's the opposite. The Grand Canyon contains a number of transgression and regression sequences. The most famous one is the lowest one, which starts with the Tapeats sandstone. Above that is a mud of the Bright Angel Shale, which is a pretty soft rock that forms these nice big slopes and benches. Then above that is the hard rock of the Muav limestone that makes these big tall cliffs. That is a transgression sequence of deepening ocean water. As we move closer toward shore, we enter the regime of the shallow water marine environment. This is on the continental shelf, but away from the shore or beach. Oftentimes, this consists of fine sediments or clay and silt that settles out away from land. It also contains skeletons of planktonic organisms that make chalk or chert. Chalk comes from diatoms, or calcium-based planktons, and chert comes from silica-based planktons that have glassy skeletons of silica. The fine silt and clay lithifies into shale. But when you have large, thick deposits of almost pure plankton, you get chalk, or diatomaceous earth. The most famous place in the world where you get that is the White Cliffs of Dover on the south coast of the UK. A little bit closer to shore, your shallow marine clastic deposits of terrigenous sediment is going to include fine sand and silt. These turn into siltstone and mudstone and usually support an active biotic community. So this is where you start to get a lot of bioturbation, which we talked about earlier in this lecture, or in part 1 of this lecture. This is an example of a terrigenous sediment plume where the river meets the sea. This is the Eel River in Northern California, which drains a very rapidly eroding section of California. So this river contains a huge amount of sediment during storms, and you can see that terrigenous sediment being carried out onto the continental shelf by ocean currents, where it then settles out and is deposited. Another feature of shallow water marine environments are oscillation ripples. So we're going to pretend that we're not on the beach and that we're, say, 200 yards off of the beach. You're still in very shallow water. We call this the nearshore environment. And sediments found in the nearshore environment include coastal beach sands. Sand is moved along the coastline by wave and current action. And these sediments are constantly being processed by wave attack. A common result of this is well-sorted, well-rounded medium sand, and later on sandstone. Beach or nearshore sandstones often preserve oscillation ripples, which we can see here in this water on the lower right. Here are some oscillation ripples preserved in 1.5 billion-year-old sedimentary rocks from Glacier National Park. These type of symmetrical oscillation ripples are indicative of a nearshore shallow water environment. Next up, we have coral reefs, which are large underwater structures composed of the solid skeletons of coral animals. So as we may think of a coral as a large, stony or branching thing, they're actually animals. They are colonial animals all living together, connected by a calcite skeleton. The coral is the animal itself, which is like a mini anemone. We can see them in close-up on the upper right. We can see all of these individual animals called polyps, and we can see one of these close-up in the lower right. It's very similar to an anemone, where it has tentacles, a mouth, and basically a stomach, and very few other parts. The colonies of corals are held together with a solid calcite skeleton. So as these polyps grow, they deposit layers of corallite or calcite around their base and sides. And the reef grows as more and more polyps grow and live and deposit calcite over time. The reef grows as new coral grows atop dead coral. The living coral, which we think of as usually brightly colored, is colored that way by photosynthesizing symbiotic microorganisms that live in the tentacles of the polyp, which we call zooxanthellae. We mostly find coral in warm tropical waters, like those off Florida, those in Hawaii. The largest reef in the world is the Great Barrier Reef, which is an enormous structure hundreds of miles long and wide off the coast of eastern Australia. In between the reef and land, you have an area called the lagoon. And this is where quiet water accumulates mud from land and calcite mud or sand from weathering of the reef. This reef is constantly... The corals on the reef are growing upwards towards sunlight, and as they get higher and higher and closer to the surface, they start to be battered by wave action. So the reef is constantly being assaulted by waves. So pieces of the reef, from individual chunks of coral called rubble to small fragments that we call calcite sand, are brought from the reef into the lagoon where they are deposited. Larger pieces tend to fall seaward and make this large rubble area called the reef face, which is made up of broken fragments of coral. On the lower right, we can see a fringing coral reef around, I believe this is Fiji, where we have the reef where the waves are breaking, and the lagoon, where the still water is accumulating mud and sediments from the coral reef and the island. There are a number of types of coral reef. A common kind is found in tropical areas around volcanic islands. So let's start with a volcanic island on the left. We have no coral growing because this young volcanic island is still growing and lava flows are burying repeatedly any areas where coral may live. The big island of Hawaii has very little coral because the sides of the island are constantly getting buried in a geological time frame by new lava flows. After the volcanoes go extinct, coral is able to colonize the fringes of that volcanic island, and you get what's called a fringing reef. The islands of Oahu, and in this example Kauai on the lower left, have great examples of fringing reefs, where lots of people go to visit and snorkel and see the coral and sea life. Now, if you remember to our earlier lectures, these heavy, dense volcanic islands are slowly subsiding or sinking into the crust over time. They are flexing the crust around them because they're so big and heavy, and as that happens, the island sinks down into the sea. As this happens, your coral reef continues to grow upwards. Oftentimes, they have evolved to balance the rate of subsidence, and that reef grows up and eventually forms a ring around your volcanic island called a barrier reef. Bora Bora in French Polynesia has a wonderful barrier reef, which you can see in the lower middle here. We have the ancient volcanic island in the center, then a deeper lagoon, and then the reef where the living coral is growing upwards and maintaining a shallow depth as the island sinks down. Eventually, the island will completely sink down and your barrier reef becomes a ring of coral reefs called an atoll. This atoll on the right, called the Hermes and Pearl Shoals, which is northwest of Hawaii, in between Hawaii and Midway Island, is a great example of an atoll. We have this ring of corals around a deeper, though still often shallower, lagoon area, where sediments have filled in the area above the ancient volcanic summit. Here are a couple of examples of fossilized coral reefs. On the left, we have brain coral, which is a species of coral still alive today that you can see in many tropical areas. This is a fossilized coral reef in Florida. About 150 to 200,000 years ago, sea levels were a little bit higher than they are today, so there are a number of coral reefs found high and dry in coastal Florida, and this is an example of one of them, Windley Key Fossil Reef Geological State Park. On the right, we have a species of coral that no longer exists. This is called a rugosa coral, some of the earliest corals we know of in the fossil record. These were found mostly from about 300 to 400 million years ago, and this example is from Death Valley National Park. We can see the structures of these corals, which are an inch or two across, and they are actually very well preserved inside this limestone. These were what we call solitary corals, so this was just sort of like the shape of a goat horn, but made of coral, sticking up above the seafloor, which was then slowly buried by limestone sediments. And that preserved these fossils very, very well. In the national park system, probably the best preserved coral reef is the Guadalupe Mountains, inside Guadalupe Mountains National Park in West Texas. It preserves a Permian, so 250 million years ago, coral reef complex in Texas, which formed around an inland sea. Texas used to have an inland sea in that time period 250 million years ago, and it was at tropical latitudes, so we had lots of coral around the edges of that sea. The area was later uplifted during the formation of the Rocky Mountains, which took all of those buried corals and uplifted them into a mountain range. The actual mountain range has this very steep cliff, which represents the ancient edge of that coral reef. This is solid limestone, absolutely riddled with coral fossils. It is the actual coral reef, uplifted and forming a mountain range. And it is flanked by the types of sediments we would expect to see. We have bedded sandstone and limestone on the seaward side of that coral reef, which also contains pieces of coral rubble. And behind the mountain range, we have those lagoon sediments of coral, calcite, sand, and mud from the continent. This is the same fossilized coral reef that Carlsbad Caverns is actually formed in. So this one preserved coral reef houses 2 national parks. Now that is a remarkable geological feature. So we've talked about our marine environments, and now we are going to move on to a couple of these transitional environments. The transition from the marine environment to our terrestrial environment. These include deltaic environments where moving water stops by entering a still or larger body of water. Beaches, the boundary between land and water shaped by waves and currents. We have tidal systems, which are affected by daily fluctuations in sea level. And we have lagoon systems, which are still coastal waters, where we have very little transportation of sediment. In this chart, we can see a variety of different depositional environments and important processes and sediment types. OM in this case is organic matter. Let's start with deltas. I love a delta. They're one of my favorite features, and they occur where sediment accumulates where a river enters quieter water, such as a lake or ocean. As the river reaches that larger body of water, it loses its energy and deposits all of the sediment. As that happens, the water spreads out and creates a large area of wetlands with numerous channels called distributaries. This is the delta of the Yukon River in Alaska, part of Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge. This occurs where the Yukon River enters the Bering Sea. We can see the main stem, the widest channel of the river, on the lower left, and we can see all of the distributaries branching off of it as this river water spreads out into different areas of the delta. During floods, much of this delta will be underwater as the river spreads out its high flow, whereas during low water it recedes into these channels of distributaries. The sediments of a deltaic system are very distinctive. We get topset beds, which are coarse sand and gravel on the top of your delta sequence. We have foreset beds, which are cross-bedded sand and gravel. And we have bottom set beds, which is usually fine-grained sands and muds. As your river system brings more sediment with it, that sediment deposits outward and falls straight out of the water column. That gives you sort of a ramp-shaped structure, which propagates into the large body of standing water. This delta actually grows outward over time as more and more sediment is brought in and deposited. And it is this process that gives us these 3 types of beds. We start with our bottom set beds, which are fine-grained, which are deposited farther away from the moving water. As more sediment is brought in, that deposits a cross-bedded, tilted layer called a foreset bed, which usually contains sand and some gravel. And then on top of that, the very surface is eroded, by the moving water channels, and then we get these more planar bedded topset beds of gravel with some sand as the channel of that stream system propagates and grows and moves out over the younger foreset beds. This diagram in the lower left shows that process very well. You just have to imagine more foreset beds being deposited seaward over time as this delta grows. Finally, we're going to talk about tidal flats or mud flats, which are sedimentary environments that are regularly flooded and drained by ocean tides. Tidal flats often have large areas of fine-grained sediment, but may also contain coarser sand. Tidal flat deposits usually contain gradational sediments, that is, gradation from sand to mud. They also may include multi-directional ripple marks, which look really cool. We also see mud cracks are commonly seen, and that is due to the sediment being regularly exposed to air during low tide and drying out. The combination of mud cracks and ripple marks is distinctive to tidal flat environments. A tidal system or an estuary contains pretty specific morphology, which we call the different structures, shapes, forms that you find. Parts of the estuary are always underwater, which we call the subtidal areas. The areas that are routinely flooded and dried as tide rises and falls is called the intertidal area. And then areas that are usually above water but are sometimes flooded during the highest tides or storms is called the supratidal area. And these all contain their unique sediments and structures. But we'll be covering tidal flats and shorelines in greater detail in a future lecture, which will entail a lot of waves, currents, and lots of sand.